In this chapter, we are going to cover human population growth. We're going to discuss demography, something called the demographic transition, how wealth, poverty, status of women, and family planning programs affect population growth, and lastly, how human population affects the environment. So remember we said there were two major drivers behind most environmental problems. The first is human population. The second is consumption rate. Well, with over 7 billion people on Earth, we have to develop strategies to decrease birth rates in developing countries and decrease consumption rates in developed countries. So let's take a look, and you'll see this graph right here on the x-axis. We have the human population in millions, and this is a little dated, but if we were to update it, you would see that for India is now at about 1,354,000,000 people, and China is now at 1,415,000,000 people. So this is 2018 data there. And the rest of them are pretty similar, a little bit lower. So again, if we take a look at this graph, and then the y-axis, of course, is the countries, you can see that China is number one when it comes to the most populous country. India isn't that far behind. China supports about a quarter of the world's population on just 7% of the planet's arable land. Now, arable land is land that can be used to grow crops. So keep that in mind. About 25% of the world's population lives on just 7% of land that crops can be grown on. So let's start by looking a little more closely at China, which is still the number one in terms of population in the world. And if we take a look, we would see that in 1949, there weren't that many people in China. There was about 540 million people. And the current regime at that time was communism, which was formed by this individual, Mao Zedong. So it was mostly a rural nation. It had just completed a war, so it was war-torn and impoverished. And that's kind of what it was like when Mao Zedong came along. But by the 1970s, the population grew to 790 million people, and that was mainly due to improvements made by Mao Zedong, which included better food production, increased distribution of food, better public health. At the time, the average Chinese woman had 5.8 children. So China did grow under his leadership. Now, the results of this population growth were good and bad. The good part was that there was huge industrial development, which was good for China, and increase in agricultural development, which meant more food. But the bad part of this was that there was a decrease in natural resources, and this was mainly due to degradation through pollution. So there was less productive soil. That means soil that was able to support crops. There was less clean water and less clean air. At the time, Chinese leaders believed that this was what was resulting in a decreased economic growth and increased poverty. So that's what was happening. So it had been good so far, but now they were expected to see less economic growth and increased poverty because of this increase in population growth. And they also knew that the loss of government stability was always followed by an overthrow of the government. So in Chinese history, every single famine had been followed by an overthrow of the government, and they didn't want to be overthrown. So Mao Zedong came up with this policy called China's one-child policy, and it started in the early 1970s, and it was spread through education and outreach efforts, encouragement of women to marry later, and increasing access to contraceptives and abortion. So if we take a look at this one-child policy, just as a reminder, by 1976, there were about 790 million people in China. So remember, the population had grown from 540 million in the 40s, so there had been an increase. And then Mao Zedong put into place his one-child, one-family policy. Well, by 1975, the population growth rate had decreased from 2.8% to 1.8%. Now, this might not seem like a lot, but when you have 790 million people, this was a result of about 8 million people less on Earth. In other words, they had 8 million less people than they would have had. So by 1979, the Chinese government decided to take more drastic measures to enforce this policy. And they said that families with only one child would have better access to schools, medical care, housing, and government jobs. And that's exactly what happened. So if people had more than one child, it was hard to get good housing. They certainly didn't get good government jobs and couldn't even get medical care. Now, on top of that, if they had more than one child, they were subject to social scorn, employment discrimination, and they got fined. And all of this really did happen. By 1984, the Chinese had relaxed the policy a little bit. And it was mainly relaxed in rural areas and for certain minorities. Now, in rural areas, it was relaxed because farm families generally needed more people to work on the farm. So they needed to have more children. In addition, so this policy really only applied to urban areas, the one-child policy. By 2016, China had changed their policy to be a two-child policy. So in 2016, China started to see their population age. There was beginning to be a lot more older people and less younger people. And so they said, okay, you can have 2 children per family. So if we look at China's one-child policy, what were the pros and cons? Well, the pros were the population growth did decrease. It did decrease. And China was better able to handle social, economic, and environmental challenges with less people. But on the other side, the cons were that there was widespread killing of female infants. And the reason for that is that in many East and South Asian cultures, like South Korea and China and India, there are deep social and cultural roots that result in people preferring male infants. One of the reasons for this is that married sons are expected to take care of their parents. Their parents live with them, and so the sons support them. For married women, they join their husband's household and they don't support their parents. So that was one of the reasons. There was also an increase in the black market trade in teenage girls in China, and that's still occurring. And one reason for that is because there's just not enough females. We can just cross this out, by the way. And lastly, there was criticism from other countries about this policy of restricting a female's choice to have a child. So let's take a look here for a minute at this graph about the world's population growth. And you can see on the x-axis down here, this is years. So if we start about here, 0, somewhere around 0, it is the current time. And then as we go back, it's years, it's before the present. So you can see here's the year 2000, 1000. BCE means before the current era, So then we've got 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 8,000. There's a big jump, 9,000. And so on the x-axis, or the y-axis here, you can see the population size of humans in billions. So you'll notice a couple things have happened here. We started out about almost 10,000 years ago with a very small amount of people, somewhere between 0 and 1 billion, but probably like a couple million people. And then along came something called the agricultural revolution. And during this time, this was about 10,000 years ago, humans changed from being hunter-gatherers to farmers. So what happened is this resulted in a more stable food supply, so people lived longer. This was called the agricultural revolution. And so the population began to increase. You can kind of see it increasing here, but again, very, very slowly. And then we came along another period called the Industrial Revolution. And in the Industrial Revolution, which was from roughly 1750 to 1850, humans went from using humans and animals to power for power to fossil fuel powered. So in other words, instead of plowing your field with a human pushing managing a plow with an animal, they went to using tractors. So we went from human animal powered to fossil fuel powered. And in fact, that's what the Industrial Revolution was about. It was about using fossil fuels for power. There is a equivalency that people use, which is that for every 2 teaspoons of diesel oil, it was equivalent to the amount of work one man did in a day. So for every 2 teaspoons of diesel oil, it was about equivalent to the amount of work one man did in a day. So the Industrial Revolution was a really big time of change, because not only were humans able to do more productive-wise, but there was an increased amount of food. This led to increase in medicine, so there were antibiotics and vaccines that were developed, increase in sanitation, so more clean water. And so you'll notice in this period of the Industrial Revolution here, there was a big jump in population. People were living a lot longer. And in fact, the growth since the Industrial Revolution, probably up to about 1960, was exponential. Exponential growth. Exponential growth is essentially when the population increases by a fixed percent. And it often has a shape kind of like the J, like a letter J. You can kind of see that right there. Now, from 1960 up to the present, we have linear growth, which is a little bit different. And right now, we are somewhere up here, a little bit over 7 billion. The population is expected to grow to around 9.9 billion by the year 2050. So this is the current estimates. By 2050, they think there's going to be about 9.9 billion people on the earth. And then after that, they expect it to kind of plateau out. What I'd like you to do is watch this movie, a quick little video. It's only 4 minutes long. And in this video, an economist, Hans Rosling, is talking about what's happened to human population over the last 200 years. And I'd like you to answer this question of what 2 variables is he comparing? So as you watch this, keep in mind and try to answer the question of what 2 variables is he comparing when he's looking at population growth? What 2 variables? What 2 variables seem to impact population growth the most? Okay, so let's move on now and talk about demography. So demography is the study of statistical changes in the human population. That's demography. Now remember, population growth is limited by carrying capacity. And remember that carrying capacity is just the maximum population that an area can support. Well, remember that only humans can raise their environment's carrying capacity through technology. And the other way, of course, they can raise their environment's carrying capacity is by taking resources from other populations, and those could be humans or animals. So you generally don't see the kind of growth in other populations that have occurred in humans. Now, how many humans can the world sustain? Do we have a carrying capacity? Well, some people say it's between 1 and 2 billion people, but that's where everyone lives prosperously in a healthy environment. So when we say 1 to 2 billion is the carrying capacity, that means everybody has what they need to live. Some people say it could go as high as up to 33 billion people. But that is where everyone is living in extreme poverty. And the environment is degraded, which means there are very few natural resources available. So a little bit about that. Now, in order to understand how populations increase or decrease, we have to be familiar with a couple of terms. So the first term I'm going to mention is simply the term that means the birth rate minus the death rate, and this is called the rate of natural increase. So the rate of natural increase. Birth rate minus death rate. Now this does not, the rate of population growth, by the way, does not count immigration. And generally in countries with good sanitation, good health care, and food, people live longer. So this information is from the Population Reference Bureau, which is a private, nonprofit scientific organization. And what they do is they gather information about population, but also about other variables. And you can see some of them here, like the birth per 1,000 people in different countries, the death rate per 1,000 people, the rate of natural increase, which we just said is the birth rate minus the death rate. And here it's a percent. And then this last variable we haven't talked about yet. So they gather information like this, they interpret it, and then they disseminate it to everybody in the world so they can use it, for their own planning purposes. So what we're going to do here is just compare a few factors that affect population in 5 countries. So I've chosen Japan, India, Somalia, China, and the US. Now here in the second column, you can see this is the population in 2018 in the millions. So which country here has the highest population? Well, it's pretty clear. It's China. China has 1,393,000,000 people. India, however, is a very close second at 1,371,000,000 people. So they're not that far behind. And then you'll see we've got the US at 328 million, Japan, and then Somalia, which is 15.2 million people. If you look at births per 1,000 people, you'll notice right off that Somalia has the highest rate, 43 births per 1,000 people. The lowest rate is Japan, and surprisingly, China and the US are kind of paired. China and the US have the same amount of births per 1,000. If you look at the deaths per 1,000 people, you'll see Somalia is right up there, but so is Japan, but perhaps for different reasons. So in Somalia, there is a very high infant mortality rate. In Japan, that is not the case. In Japan, their population is aging. So there's a lot of older people. And so people are dying naturally of natural causes. Here, children are dying from disease and other things. You'll notice the lowest death per 1,000 people is in India. And then if we look at the rate of natural increase, you can see that Somalia by far has the greatest rate of natural increase. So this is an indication of how fast their population is growing. Anything less than 1 means the population is not growing, it's actually getting smaller. So you can see in China, even though China has the #1 population in the world, their population, their increase, their rate of, the percent of increase is going down. And in the US, the percent of increase is going down. In China, it's a negative. So China is decreasing, their population is decreasing the fastest. So population growth does depend on several factors. And as we said, it depends on the rate of birth and death, but it also depends on migration, people leaving or coming. If you want to add individuals to a country, you can either do it through birth or through immigration. To remove individuals from a country, this occurs either through death or emigration, people leaving. So technological advances have led to a big drop in death rate. So people are not dying as quickly anymore from disease and poverty and things like that. And the larger gap between birth and death rates, the larger the gap you have, the more population growth you get. So if you have a very low amount of death rates, but you have a high amount of birth rates, you would expect to see a big population change. Since the 1970s, the growth rates in many countries have been decreasing, in many countries in the world. In fact, the global growth rate has decreased partially due to a steep decrease in birth rates. To understand this, we need to look at something called total fertility rate. And total fertility rate just means the total number of children that a woman will have in her lifetime. Okay, so total fertility rate is the total number of children that a woman will have in her lifetime. The fertility rate at which a couple replaces themselves is about 2 children per couple. So that makes sense, right? If you want to replace yourself in the future, and there's two parents, then you need to have 2 children. They call this the replacement fertility rate. So you might say, well, of course it's 2 children, but believe it or not, so the total fertility rate is what keeps the size of a population stable, and it should be 2, except some children die before they reproduce. Okay, so if someone has a child that dies before they reproduce, then they need to have another one in order to replace themselves. And not every female has children. So if one female doesn't have a child, then another couple has to have an extra one to replace her. In the U.S., the total fertility rate is around 2.1, which indicates that some females do not have children and some children die before they reproduce. So if you think about this, in countries that have a high infant mortality rate, so a lot of their infants die, you would expect the replacement fertility to be what? 2, less than 2, or higher than 2? Well, if you answered higher than 2, you would be correct. So if you have a lot of infants dying, then the typical couple would have to have more than 2 children to replace themselves. So that's an example of something that can affect total fertility rate. But total fertility rate can drop due to several factors. So for example, increased urbanization. So the more city-like families live in, the less children they have, the lower fertility rate. And the reason for that is it's more expensive to live in a city. Children have to go to school, and that costs money. So the more urbanization, the lower the fertility rate. Another factor would be Social Security. So if you have Social Security services, meaning there is financial support of older people, then elderly people don't have to have as many children to support them anymore. And so the total fertility rate goes down. Another thing is more education. So as women become more educated and enter the labor force, there's less emphasis on child rearing, and so you often see a lower total fertility rate. Women have less children. And finally, greater access to contraception. So the more women have access to the contraception, the less children they tend to have, the lower the total fertility rate. So population growth is affected by several what they've called demographic factors. And even though this data is a little bit dated, it is still very relevant. Now, the demographic factors are the things that you see here. These are demographic factors, things that affect the population rate. And we've already talked about total fertility rate. That's a demographic factor. We've even mentioned infant mortality rate. So if you look at this graph, you'll see in the first column is the demographic factor. And then the next one is the demographic factor for the world. Then you've got more developed countries. And by developed, even though this is kind of an outdated term, it means countries where there is a lot of access to education. Women are usually in the workforce. Women are usually educated. There's really a high gross domestic product. Less developed countries, kind of the opposite. Less education for women, more poverty, more infant mortality, a lower gross domestic product. And then we have Niger here as the fastest growing country. So we're going to compare these, and for population, you can see that we are greater than 7 billion right now in the world. The more developed countries have its population is about 1.3 billion, and the less developed is 5.9. So you can see that most of the people in the world are in the less developed countries, and with Niger, you've got 16.9 million. This is one country. If you look at the percent growth rate, you can see by far the highest growth rate is in Niger. Second highest, developed country. And then if you look at most developed, there's a huge difference. If we look at crude birth rate, again, looks like a little pattern here from least developed down to most developed. When you look at death rates, again, you can see Niger, and then we see the more developed being number 2 and the least developed being number 1. This is kind of interesting. And a big part of this, the death rate, is not that there is less medicine available in the developed country. It's that you have aging populations. And so people are dying of natural causes. Again, we have total fertility rate, which is the highest in Niger, second highest in less developed, third highest in more developed. Infant mortality rates, again, you're seeing this pattern here. Life expectancy goes the other way. But again, people live the longest in the more developed countries, then the second longest in the less developed in a very short period of time, 57 years in Niger. And lastly, interestingly, they're comparing wealth per capita. Now, per capita means per person, if you are not aware of that, per capita, per person. And GNP stands for gross national product, but it's an indicator of how much that country is producing. And you can kind of see there's a very clear pattern here in terms of wealth. So my question for you is, which demographic factors seem to be related to population size? And I believe I've kind of already gone over this, because if you look at the populations at the top here, you can see that the most populous countries are the least developed. Niger is probably the most populous per country, if you want to look at it per country. But clearly, you're seeing the highest growth rate, the highest birth rate, the highest death rate the highest fertility rate and the highest mortality rate in countries that have the highest percent growth. So what I would say is that the population growth rate is the highest in countries with the highest birth rate, the highest death rate, the highest total fertility rate, the highest infant mortality rate. And the lowest life expectancy. I would also say, and I think you can see it here, is that the more wealthy people are, the lower the population. So you can see that the lowest population is in the more developed countries, and they have the most wealth per capita. And then the next is the less developed countries, which have a lot less wealth per capita. And lastly, in Niger, the fastest growing country in the world, there's the least amount of growth per capita. So wealth seems clearly to be related to growth rate. The more money people have, the less children they have. If you remember back to Hans Rolling's video, you'll remember that this is what he was comparing. It was wealth to life expectancy. Just another note about total fertility rate with women is that you can see as women become educated, their total fertility rate drops. They're having less children per female. So on the x-axis is years of schooling girls can expect to receive, and the y-axis is the total fertility rate. And these little orange dots are actually data per different countries. If you were to draw a line between these, or if you were to fit these to a curve through a computer program, there's clearly a linear relationship between how many years of schooling a female has and what her fertility rate is. So the bottom line here is that the more educated women are, the more they are likely to enter the workforce. If they enter the workforce, they're probably going to have less children. Worldwide now, females are in school an average of 7 years. That means up to 7th grade. And that might not seem like a lot to you, but keep in mind this is a worldwide average. Fertility rates also decrease when women have access to family planning and contraceptives. And in this particular graph, you can see that you've got two countries in each graph, and they are compared. The countries are paired kind of like this because they have similar cultures, similar economies, and also similar populations. So on the x-axis of each of these is the years, and the y-axis is the total fertility rate. The blue line are countries that had access to family planning and contraceptives. The red line is the countries that didn't have access to family planning and contraceptives. And it's pretty clear, here we'll look at Iran and Iraq, but Iran and Iraq are very similar. Iran had access to family planning, and you can see that there's a steep drop in their total fertility rate or the number of children that each woman has. Bangladesh had access to family planning, Pakistan did not. Again, big difference in total fertility rate. Kenya had access to family planning. Even though they started higher out than Malawi, they ended up much below Malawi in total fertility rate. The Dominican Republic had access to family planning. Haiti did not. And again, you see that difference. So my question for you is this data convincing to you? Does this convince you that if women have access to contraceptives and family planning, they will have less children per female? And if it is, why? And if it isn't, why not? So if you are convinced, okay, but there is still a very large unmet need for access to contraceptives. So if we take a look at this graph, you can see on the x-axis here, it's the percent of married women without access to birth control. and the y-axis are different countries throughout the world. The orange is from 1990 to 1995, and the blue is from 2000 to 2005. But if you look at this country by far, it's clear who has the greatest need for access to contraceptions, and it is sub-Saharan Africa. And this is where the population is rapidly increasing. You can see that in Latin America and the Caribbean, there's been a bit of a drop in the need for access to contraceptives. The same is true of South and Southeast Asia. North and Western Africa is declined, but not as much. So there is still a need for this access to contraceptives. However, it is declining. So you can see this data only went up to 2005. Because of resources supplied by other countries in the world, this need is not as great as it's shown in this picture. In 2018, 62% of married women worldwide use contraceptives. In China, it was 85%. In the US, 73%. And in Somalia, 15%, a country in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see there's a real difference here in access. The other thing that really decreases fertility rates is when more infants survive. And so on this graph, you can see the infant mortality rate on the x-axis, okay? That means how many deaths per 1,000 births. And on the y-axis is the total fertility rate. How many children does each woman have? And there are a lot of dots here, which is data collected from different countries, but if you took all the data and fit it to a line in a computer program, you would see that there is a linear relationship between infant mortality and total fertility rate. That means the two of these are directly related. The longer that children survive, the less, or I should say this here, so if the infant mortality rate is high, a lot of infants die, women are going to have more children. But if the infant mortality rate is low, not a lot of infants die, women are going to have less children. This is about 1.5 children per female. And again, the reason for this is women who have, in countries where infants don't survive, women tend to have more children. Lastly, poverty and population growth are related. On the x-axis here, you can see this is time in years, and on the y-axis, this is global population in the billions. Red is the developing countries, and remember, these are the countries with having a higher gross domestic product, more education, more technology, more women who are working, and the blue are developed countries, which is the opposite. The dotted lines are where they are supposedly have projected. And of course, we are, somewhere in here right now. So we do have better data for this. But you can see that the global population is expected to increase a lot more in developing countries than developed countries. Developed countries almost look like it's steady, it's a plateau. And this is often because in poor societies, there are higher fertility rates, partly because there is not as much access to contraceptives. In addition, most women do not have access to education, and the infant mortality rate is very high. It means a lot of babies die. So women tend to have more children, and this is what results in the higher population growth. So again, if you can remember back to Hans Rowling and the comparison he was making, this was the comparison he was making between wealth and population growth.